Good morning, church. It's good to see you again. I wanted to ask them to put this slide up real quick so we can make mention. Walk for Water is today. You may not, if you were here several weeks ago, we had a representative for Walk for Water come here to talk to you about the good work that goes on there. And I really encourage you, if you have any availability, even if you have not signed up or anything, come out to Leeds Memorial Park today. That is the place that will be this year. It moves year to year kind of around the Birmingham area, maybe a little bit further out for some of you, but I think you'll learn some things. You'll get to hang out with some other Christian brothers and sisters. We have a little worship service before we dismiss as well, so we would love for you to come and be a part of that. If you have donated, that is awesome. You can go on the website and donate. You can donate directly through the church here when you give your contribution today. If you have a separate amount that you want to give for Walk for Water, you can denote that. I went on this morning, and one of the things that is new that I did not know before this morning, and I know this may have been available on some level, but it made it really simple, is you can go on the website and you can give a monthly contribution. They'll just auto-draft from your account each month. So even if it's $10 a month, and by the end of the year you'll have given $120 that will go towards Walk for Water. Or give $20 a month, or whatever it may be. But it's real simple to set up. You can go on there. So even if you're not walking, I would just tell you how to do this. Register like you were going to walk, and then it will give you the opportunity to give a contribution on there that's recurring. At least that's how I know it will work. It may work other ways, and you may find that. But I really encourage you to get behind this because it is a great way in which we are able to do good to people, for people. And we, here's the cool thing about this. We usually get back books, and by the way, if you ever want to look at some of those books, let me know. There's usually some in the office. Show the wells. You can see the faces of the people that you're helping, specifically the wells that are drilled because of the funds that are raised here, right? And it's not a generic book that everybody gets a copy of. No, it's a book that we get that's just the wells that we dig, that are dug with the funds from here. But I think one of the good things for us as Christians is we're given to people here who can give us nothing back. They can give us nothing back. We're showing that part of being Christ followers is being able to give without any expectation of return. And it's sometimes hard to do that, isn't it? That's just, it's hard to do that on so many levels. But in this particular instance, I think it's a wonderful way in which we can give without expecting return. We can give without expectation of return, and I think that can be a thing that helps us in our Christian walk. Okay, so we're continuing this morning. I know last week we got two sermons for the price of one. When I was leaving last week, David was out there talking to the men who had been counting the money. He said, I don't know if we got enough in the contribution to pay double this week since we got two sermons. But luckily, this morning is daylight savings time, and that was just God's way of giving the preacher an extra hour. So, I'm joking. Okay. I will try not to be as long as last week, especially since we have some activities and things going on, but I do want you to know that this is very, very important stuff that we're discussing. If you've been in our Sunday morning class, you know it's not always easy stuff to get all the details right on. One of my goals last week and this week, and it sounds like a bad goal really, is I said I want to muddy the water a little bit. And I do just because I want us to be humble in admitting that sometimes we all are going to struggle sometimes to get to agreement on all of this stuff. And that's okay. But this will be the last, I hope, I think, of these lessons specifically regarding this. I may at times in the series that we had ongoing, that we interrupted to do this, make some mentions of leadership role and stuff because we are studying Old Testament leaders, and I think there's some things we can learn there to apply into what we're doing. Last week, you'll know that we mentioned kind of some of the weaknesses in our model. Our model is not in the sense that I believe that there's some divinity to our model. What I mean by that is I believe that God gave us some instructions that helped shape some parts of our model, even a good portion of our model. But it's not a perfect model because God gave a perfect book to an imperfect people. And so we've struggled to figure out all the ways that we implement it. But we've noticed some of the weaknesses where the leaders typically don't have theological training, and that wasn't meant to say that they don't have authority. It was just simply meant to say that sometimes we get on different playing fields sometimes, and where we're at with theological training. And I mentioned, spoke to David yesterday, and I said one of the things that we in Churches of Christ have traditionally not done, or traditionally done, is we give way more training to our ministers than we do our elders. And that's not really the way it should be. It's just kind of the way it has evolved, and that's not the way it should be. So we recognize that, and one of the things I said is we need people. I have no idea why we're. Jose, bring me a couple of new batteries. The battery on this is starting to go, I think, and usually if it starts to go, it's gone. So. I don't know. I apologize. All right, let's try that again. All right, so also we don't have built-in accountability, and so we have to make sure that we find ways to be accountable, and then ultimately the alignment is sometimes tough. Last week we just kind of talked about the weaknesses, and the problem with just talking about the weaknesses is it sounds pretty negative. I tried are, I think, textually strengthened by our model. One is that we have a plurality of leaders. It means no man takes full charge by himself. I think that is not only textual, it is practical. It is the way that church history functioned for quite a long time before we had some rifts along the way. So plurality was always kind of a part on some level that the church was not ruled by a single individual, but there would be those layers of accountability. And plurality, when done right, is good. Second, our model is what we call an autonomous model. Okay, autonomous is just a fancy way of saying that outside of the walls of this building, our leadership doesn't answer to anyone about the direction of this church. And that has great potential in it. Are there sometimes pitfalls for it? Sure. Just like any strength, there's potential for weakness in it. But I do think that at the end of the day, a church getting to make decisions for itself, and especially if we're trying to keep in line with Scripture, benefits the church more than having outside accountability. In other words, accountability to someone who's not a part of this church and this local church. So this church has what we call individual autonomy. Now, sometimes I call it great potential in autonomy. And part of that is because when it's implemented well, churches like this can be more agile. What I mean by that is we can see a need and we can address a need, we can shift and we can move, and we can, in theory, do that quicker than if we have layers of accountability that we have to go through in order to make decisions. Now, that's not functionally always how it happens, but we have the potential to be a fast-moving church. In other words, we see need, we can meet need quickly. And I mean that both to meet individual needs, but also collective needs. In other words, we don't have to have permission to make changes when we see something that is more biblical or more practical and no less biblical. Okay? You'll hear me use that phrase a lot, right? I want us to be biblical, and then I want us to be practical when we can be practical, more practical, better if it's no less biblical. And sometimes that's the way we do. So in response to our weaknesses last week, just in review, we talked about choosing men who followed after the Spirit, had the Spirit living in them. We talked about from Galatians the fruit of the Spirit, and that was the marker of a Christ follower. We want leaders who have that Spirit working and active and living in them. We talked about the need for choosing humble men who would choose accountability, and then ultimately men who would choose accountability in the way they do things. So this week we're going to hop to a couple of more texts. I had planned on maybe going through 3 texts, and I chose to just specifically go through 2 texts this morning. The first one is not the one you would probably expect when we think about elders, because it's not a verse that we have frequently talked about when we talk about elders. James there, in a letter that is meant to be very practical, says, "Is there anybody among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord." This tells us a little bit about the nature of who elders are being called to be. They're being called to be men who are men of prayer. Not just men who will get up and pray, but men who have prayer implemented in their daily life. But the second part of this gets a little fuzzier, doesn't it? To my knowledge, I've heard of some situations, but I know no one personally who has asked the elders of the church to come and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. Maybe you do. If you do, I would love to hear those stories. I always think they're fascinating, but it's just not something that has translated into our society. So this week, I just got to thinking, what would happen if somebody asked me to go and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord? Like, what would I do? Do I stop by Walmart on the way to pick up some oil? Where do I get the oil? Do I need to make the oil myself? Is there a recipe that I need to follow? Can I just go to the pantry? Can I go to my deep fryer where I made chicken wings last night? You know, I mean, what do we do? And I would have no clue, right? I don't know what I would do. I mean, but the question is, for me, I said, when we're thinking about this passage in view of elders, and I almost didn't include it, but I thought, I would like to know what kind of man. It would tell me a lot about a man, what they would do when they don't know what to do. In other words, what God is giving us here is a spiritual activity and a spiritual moment. And He wants elders and shepherds and guides who will go and be present with people in spiritual moments. And quite honestly, I don't know, Jay's here, David Copeland's out right now, but David Wood is back there. I didn't ask them before. I should have polled the elders before, but I said, well, somebody called you today, what would you do? What would you do? What would you do? And part of what we know about being and leading and being in leadership spots is you will find yourself in spots that you never imagined you would find yourself in. There will be a day that somebody calls and asks you to anoint them with oil. Maybe not that specifically, but there will be a moment where somebody calls you to do something spiritual. And you could not go back to that person in this moment. If we pointed an elder and somebody called you and said, hey, I want you to come anoint me with oil. What you could not do is say, well, that's not in the Bible, right? It's in the Bible. And you might say, well, we don't do that. But what if the person said, but it's in the Bible? right? What do we do? And so I would just suggest that we need to choose men who are willing to be present in spiritual moments, who can be spiritual forces in spiritual moments. You may never ask the elders to come and anoint you with oil, but you're going to be sick at some point in your life. What is the response among the leadership? How did we respond in those moments? And when they're in those moments, I think this is where we pull in all that other text about what kind of man we're looking for. What kind of presence are they in that moment? Are they there out of obligation? Or are they out there because they care and they're concerned? And they may not know how to anoint you with oil, but they'll do their best in the moment. So I would say that when we choose men, we need to choose men who are willing to be present and active and in spiritual ways. Because, again, something we mentioned in Bible class this morning, when you get into a leadership role, it is so easy to be inundated with demands of having to go here, go do this, take care of this, take care of that, that we can quickly neglect the spiritual, which is the main purpose. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. All right, next, 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7. We're going to break this up into kind of two sections, and we're going to talk a little bit about Titus too. Okay, Titus has a list that is not very similar. I mean, it is similar in nature, but it's not exactly the same. And so we're going to have to ask the question is why are the lists not the same? Okay, we're going to talk about that a little bit. But right now, just want to get into the heart of the list in a very broad way of what we're looking for in men that lead. Paul tells Timothy, and Timothy is over the churches at what city? Who knows? Can somebody tell me? Can somebody tell me? Somebody knows, you're being humble. Timothy is ministering to the churches in, starts with an E and ends with Ephesus. Okay. Ephesus, good job. How did you know? Okay. So he's appointing the elders in the city of Ephesus. Okay. And he's called to appoint elders throughout the city to serve the church in that city and to rule the city in spiritual manner. Here's what he says about it. He says, whoever aspires to that, desires that, to be an overseer, desires a noble task. One of the things that I have experienced in my life is I have experienced men who I thought were highly qualified to serve in a leadership role in the church, but said they did not have the desire. Okay? And if a man does not have the desire, it is a red flag, so to speak. But I also want to encourage you, if maybe you're someone who says, I just don't know if I have the desire, to make sure that sometimes there is a fine line between desire and humility. You may be too humble to serve, and that's the man I want leading. The one who's asking the questions of, am I worthy of this calling and this spot? If you're asking those questions, that's the man that I think is most qualified. I'm always a little concerned when a man wants to be an elder too bad. Okay? I'll just be honest. When I see someone who just is militantly marching towards being in control and in charge and having authority, that is a huge red flag for me. Because I want people who desire the role, but also to be humble, right? And so sometimes those can be at odds with each other. So if maybe you're thinking about serving, or maybe you're called to serve here, and you might say, well, I just don't desire it. Let me ask you to just ask of yourself, why do you not desire it? Is it just simply because, we got to go back a couple here, don't we? There. That's where I need to be. Oh, go way back, sorry. There we are. All right. So desire is part of it. I think desire is part of it. I think a man that we have to talk into being an elder is sometimes that's not a bad thing. Because if they're humble, that's the people we want. if it's a humility thing, if they really truly do not feel that they can work in the Lord's church effectively, that's a different question. So one, I do think a man needs to have some desire for the role on some level. Okay? The overseer is to be above reproach. This is one of, if not totally, not the only, but it's honestly just one of the ones I struggle with a little bit, because I've not met very many people, at least using English terms and English ways, that were above reproach. In other words, not able to really find anything to charge them with. We don't have perfect people, right? So what is Paul trying to communicate? He's trying to say you got to find the perfect people. We're all in trouble. Well, maybe not trouble, but we're not going to find anybody. I do think what Paul is trying to communicate here is that we need to find men who are respected. It's about general respect. When people see that man, they may say many things about that man. They may not, whatever they may say, they need to be people that the church respects. And so that, I think, is the kind of the gist of being above reproach, is just that they're a respectable person, faithful to his wife. We'll talk a little bit more. I'm going to save a little bit about the faithful to his wife for when we get down to talk about children as well. But what do we learn about a man who is faithful to his wife? It really goes with the thing right above it, doesn't it? About being above reproach, about being a man who can be trusted. Can he be trusted in the relationship he has with his wife? Does he dominate that relationship? Does he command over that relationship? Does his wife see in him his value and his worth? One of the best ways to know whether or not a man is fit to serve as an elder is typically if you can get the wife on a lie detector machine in a room to tell the truth. Okay, now we're not going to put anybody on lie detector tests, but I'm just telling you, it's the way you can find out. But is he respectable in his family dealings? Temperate. Notice he's going to go through several here that kind of go together. Does he have an even temper? Is he self-controlled? Is he respectable? Hospitable? Able to teach? Not given to drunkenness, right? Not violent, but gentle. And I want to go a little bit beyond just the violent part, okay? Violence is not always just physical, right? I've met violent people that I've never seen lay a hand on anyone, but they're hair trigger, angry, and when they don't get their way about something, they, instead of humbly trying to figure out, work through a problem, they have outbursts of anger. That would be the opposite of being violent, because the very nature of being gentle is someone who can serve in a way that when they don't get their way, or when they're struggling to articulate or struggling to get through with somebody, they keep their cool under pressure, which goes into the next thing: not quarrelsome, not somebody who's looking for a fight, and not a lover of money. The lover of money thing, for those who understand church leadership, we have the perfect example of why we don't need people who love money. And it's the man who betrayed our Lord Jesus Christ for some money. And we want men who do that. In this little section of teaching, I like to summarize this section of teaching just simply this way: we need to choose good men. I'm not telling you that good is all we need, right? There are good men who I don't think are ready to serve as elders or shepherds in the church. But there are no instances where I think an ungood man should serve. Okay, ungood's not a word, but I made it up, and I've got the microphone, so that happened. Okay, not good. We want good people, not bad people, right? And that's pretty self-explanatory. But I think it's interesting when sometimes we talk about the qualifications, and we use that term qualifications of a man. We're typically, a lot of times in my history of the church, it has a lot to do with what boxes they can check off. And I want to start with just the fact: are they a good person, right? Do people think they're a good person? Do they know that person to be a good person? All right, Timothy will continue. And he says this: he must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. In other words, he's showing leadership skills he's showing leadership skills in his home that can transfer over to the church. Verse 5 explains that. It says, if anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? So this is where we kind of start hitting some roadblocks in some teaching. Okay, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, if you go over to Titus's list, it looks a lot more like he's talking about having believing children. In other words, they're children who believe, as in are baptized children, so to speak. And sometimes we've held that model up for people. Okay, the problem is well, I'm getting ahead. We'll come back. But here's the nature of what Paul is trying to communicate here is that with his wife and with his family and those he has care over, he's shown that he's able to manage things. I've mentioned in our Sunday school class, a church not far from here, a very, very conservative Church of Christ in the 70s, had a man in office as an elder who never had children. He wasn't able to have children. He didn't, but he was able, he was a school teacher. And he was a school principal. And the argument was made by that church that man showed that he could manage well everything that God had entrusted in him. And they put him as an elder. He served for many years as an elder. I'm not telling you that's the call of the church here. I'm going to get to that in a minute. I'm just telling you that people have interpreted this passage a few different ways. They've interpreted it to mean that he's got to have kids and they've got to be baptized and he's got to be married. And some have interpreted if you are married or if you do have kids, or if they need to show respect and honor in what God has entrusted to you, right? And we recognize here, I'm not telling you it's not what God meant, but the man who's given this name is Paul, and he had no wife and he had no kids. And he wasn't a leader in the early church. But he's also saying this, right? The text is there. We can't ignore it altogether, right? And so what do we do with it has become a struggle in churches. I want to get to that a little bit in just a minute, but here's what I want to say first. I just want to simply say that what he's primarily, the big communication thing that he wants you to see is that what is he doing with what God has entrusted in him, and has he had enough entrusted to him to prove that he knows how to manage a family, a group of people, a situation. And that's the primary thing, I think, because of verse 5, where it says, if he doesn't know on his own family, how can he take care of God's church? The point is, has this man proven that he can take care of God's church? Right? It says he must not be a recent convert, or he may be conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. I've done a little bit of the math in Ephesus. The church in Ephesus was probably founded somewhere, let's just put it this way. The church in Ephesus was probably somewhere between 15 or 20 years old at this point, okay? He's not telling you that you can't be an elder until you've been in the church for 35 years. That's not what he's saying. But he is saying that you need to be grounded in faith. How quickly can a man become grounded in faith? Well, he doesn't give us a year. He doesn't say that can happen in 5 years. He doesn't say that can happen in 7 years or 10 years, right? It just says that he needs to be grounded in faith so that he doesn't fall under the same judgment as the devil. He needs to be a man who has proven himself to have a grasp of what following Jesus looks like. We want people who have proven they can follow Jesus. He must have a good reputation with outsiders so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. What do people outside of the church say about this man? I've mentioned to you before, I think, there's a church local to Birmingham. It's not a Church of Christ. And they actually put out a full page ad, but they put an advertisement in the Birmingham News several years ago and said, these are the men we're about to put in as elder. And one of the things that it says is they need to have a good reputation with outsiders. And we would like to know from the community if there's anybody that knows why these men might or might not serve. I've seen a lot of things happen when we've talked to people about putting them inside as elders, but I've never seen anybody go and talk to his boss or his employees. And it might not be a bad idea. Who are you when you have control and authority over other people? If you've proven yourself to be successful in a business sense, that's great. But did you get there because you were good to people, or did you get there because you were a lover of money? Because that can happen either way. What's Paul trying to communicate in these 4 verses? I would primarily say that he's not only saying that you choose good men, he's saying you need to choose proven men. Men who have proven themselves to be Jesus followers, who are capable of leading other Jesus followers to be closer to what it is to be like Jesus. That's the end of the good men and proven men can do that. And that's what I think Paul is primarily trying to communicate. But we do come to this problem, right? Why do Paul's list in Timothy and Titus not match? If you'll compare those lists, you'll see that there's a lot of matching that does happen. But there's also some big numbers there that don't happen. There's some, the term being hospitable, right? What does it mean for an elder to be hospitable in America in 2023? And how is that different than it was back then? It's pretty different in many ways. I'll just simply say that it's interesting that Paul gives one church, the church at Ephesus, in the book of 1 Timothy, one list, and then he gives Titus, which is over the churches in Crete, another list. One, at least if you get as literal as you can get, says that you got to have children who are faithful to you and that you lead them well. One says you got to have believing children. So what has been the answer sometimes is we've made like a super list, right? In other words, to be a leader in Church of Christ today, you got to be eligible on all of these factors. The problem with that is that's not how the Bible worked. Timothy did not have Titus's list, at least initially, and Titus did not have Timothy's list. When Timothy went out to appoint elders, what he had was what we just read. And so that's all he had access to. The Bible as we know it, in the way it came into form, wouldn't happen until centuries later. So there were many instances where one church might have a copy of Timothy, but they might not have a copy of Titus. It may not be what's there. And so when they go to appoint elders, all they have is the one list or the other list. So why does Paul give us some differences in these lists? Is it because Paul didn't know what he wrote in one letter and he decided he needed to put something different in the other letter? I don't think that's accurate. Okay, I think that's being major. We're supposing a lot of things there. I would suggest 2 things that I think really guide us a little bit in understanding that Paul gives 2 different lists to 2 different churches. Okay? I'm convicted that Paul was displaying there would be some local variation. In other words, I think most likely Paul was giving Timothy a list for Ephesus, and Paul was giving Titus a list for Crete. And they are in many ways a list. I hate calling them a list. It's just kind of the way they are functionally in the Bible. Now, what does that mean for Palisades 2,000 years later? Well, that's very difficult to discern. What list? Daniel has always said, I'm comfortable if you were qualified for Ephesus, that's good enough for me. If you were qualified for Crete, that's good enough for me. All right? But we have to admit there's some variation here. There's some differences between these 2 lists. They just are not exactly the same. So do we have to have a man who follows into all of these, or is it just some of them? I'm not telling you where you need to fall on that. You may not agree with me on that, and that's okay. I'm convicted Paul was saying there would be some variation, partially on what? I think some churches were in a more mature spot than other churches. And I don't think Paul ever meant for a city or for a church to go without leadership. And sometimes the question is would you rather have a slightly less qualified leader or no leader at all? Right? And for me, I think you're better off with a slightly less qualified. And I don't mean somebody who violates the nature of these passages. I just mean that sometimes we may not find perfect candidates. If we're looking for somebody who can literally check off all of these boxes, and we interpret these texts as literally as we can, we probably end this process with no elders. Maybe not even the ones we have. And I don't mean that, I've told them that, okay? And I don't mean that in a nasty or mean way. I'm just saying that I think that a church is better with leaders who exhibit the spirit of what is being exemplified here, even if they don't match off and are able to knock off every single box like what we have here. Okay? And so we've had a lot of problems with a lot of things. We'll look at some of those that we've had problems with in the past by looking at it. And so that just leads us to this, and this is kind of the synopsis of all this. I'm convicted that Paul is trying to give us the quality of a man more than the qualifications of a man. Does that mean there are no qualifications? I don't think that's the way we take that, and I don't want to leave you with that impression. But I am thinking that Paul is trying to give us a beautiful ideal of what kind of man you need to be looking for. And you need to find amongst yourselves the ones that meet those criteria as close as you possibly can. Because those men are good and proven, in addition to humble we talked about last week, and open to accountability, and all those things that we've talked about. We need to find the best among us that can serve us and lead us in the days ahead. Now, that becomes problematic. The rubber meets the road in a few things here. Here are the things that churches have traditionally fought about. Must a man be married? Must he have children? Is there another way to satisfy those things? Must a man have baptized children? Must it be a man at all? I will go ahead and tell you, there's consensus among the leadership here that part of it because of the teaching role of the eldership and what it represents. I think there's general consensus here that we have been a male-led, we're a complementarian church. In other words, we believe God gave roles on some level. I don't think we're arrogant enough to say that we've got every nuance of that figured out, but in this particular instance, I think the leadership, I'm speaking on behalf of them, I think that they're unanimous in it needing to be a man here, but churches have fought over that, and they're fighting over that today. And let's go a little further. Must a man's baptized children be faithful after they leave home? Do they have to be faithful to God forever? What if one falls away from the church 20 years after they leave the elder's home? Then we get into also other ones. Some that I didn't put up there. I don't think you can read those, which may be for my good anyway. But what happens if a man is married and then loses his wife? I've seen some elderships that say that man can no longer serve as an elder. I served under an eldership that said a man could serve under that until he remarried another faithful Christian, and then he could no longer serve as an elder. And I'm just telling you, we fought over a lot of this stuff, and I don't agree with that take, by the way. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just telling you it happens. And there's tough questions that we have to answer for. And here is where Daniel gets to celebrate and jump up and down and say, amen, is that I don't make the judgment calls, right? I don't decide. That's the joy. So if you hated everything that I've said, you're in luck, because I'm not the one that makes those decisions. I don't make the judgment calls here. I'm trying to bring some text and some nuance and to tell you these things are not simple, but they're serious, right? But at the end of the day, Daniel's not the one that gets to Daniel, in our model, the way we do things, I don't get to handpick who serves here as elders. And that's a good thing, because if you disagreed with it, then, that would not be good for me, right? I don't make the judgment calls on these types of issues. And so anything I say that you have heard that you may disagree with, I'm okay with that, because I'm not the one that's ultimately going to make the judgment call on it, and I'm not trying to set myself up as the one who will. I'm just trying to try to give you the text as best I understand it and where Daniel falls. So the next slide is Daniel's opinion, okay, based on my study and what I've studied through the years and where I fall on elders. Okay, you already here it is. This is it in synopsis, and it doesn't really matter because look at the slide on the screen right now, right? I don't make the judgment calls, right? So here's where Daniel falls. I'm happy serving, and hear me. Let's go back because I don't want you to read ahead. It's not just me. My family's here. So this is about my kids, my wife, and those who lead them. And so this is personal for me. Not just because of me and my position, it's personal because it impacts my family and how they're led in the future by godly men or ungodly men. And so this is, with all that weight of the last couple of weeks when I've had speaking about this, it all all that is included. This is not just about what Daniel gets out of it or what Daniel doesn't get out of it. It impacts my family, my kids' future. How, I know this for a fact, because I've seen it over and over, how young adults end up viewing the world after they get out of their church a lot of times falls back into what kind of leaders were leading their church when they were kids. And so it's important. And I've seen people leave churches not because they don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus anymore. And I've seen them leave the church not because they don't believe in Jesus anymore. It's because they had men who were domineering and dominating and not caring about the condition of the souls that they were put in charge of. Okay? And so I have to ask these questions of myself because I've got kids here who this will impact. Okay? So I say that to show you the weight that I feel when I say this about what I feel. I'm happy serving under men who are godly, who are spiritual, who are humble, who are accountable, who are good men, and who are proven men. If you can knock off those boxes, for me, I'm satisfied. Okay? Now, what makes a man proven? Okay? I'm trying to make it simple, but I'm also admitting it's complex. Right? This is where Daniel falls. Proven, good, accountable, humble, spiritual, and godly. If I can get that, for me and my family, I'm satisfied with who's leading my family. Because this impacts them, and this impacts me, and impacts this whole church. Okay? We sometimes, you notice what's not up there and what I've not mentioned at any point during this is anything to do with a man being good at business, being successful at his job in the sense of working his way up the corporate ladder, right? You haven't seen that on any of these lists. Do you know why? It's because they're not in the Bible. Some of the best elders that I have ever worked with worked in factory jobs, and they were respected and loved in those jobs, but they never in the corporate world. And sometimes those men that I'm thinking about, is because they were so humble. And that's the man I want leading, okay? And so here what I'm saying is that we just spent 2 weeks talking a whole lot about where a man's spiritual life is. And that's because the primary role biblically for elders and shepherds, as we see the text as we lay it out, is a spiritual role. It is about guiding the spiritual work of the church. That's why I've challenged the elders in this process, and I'm challenging anybody that's sitting in this audience that may be put in as an elder going forward. You need to delegate out as much business of the church as you possibly can. That's not the role of elders biblically. It's just not in the text. If we're going to be a biblical church and a non-denominational church, it does not matter what the church has done for the last 50 years. If we're going to be biblical, we need to ask what the Bible says, right? And the Bible shows men who are not business leaders or business meetings. They were spiritual leaders. Now, let me tell you, I'm getting on my hobby horse a little bit here, and it ain't just about this church. Every church I've ever served in has struggled. Once we get people who are in leadership roles and they get busy with the work, the business of the church, and we sometimes neglect the spiritual. Here's what I have seen our custom to be. You may have seen it differently. If you have, praise God. But I'm just telling you what I've seen. Our custom has been to schedule the business. We always take care of the business, and we deal with the spiritual PRN. All right, we've got some nurses in the audience. What does PRN mean? As needed. Anybody actually know what it means? Anybody know the Latin? Anybody? Oh, man, I looked it up. It's pro re nata. Okay. It means as needed. Okay. If you ever get in a situation, I'm using that term a lot because when I deal with therapy with people, right? You're going to go to therapy this number of times a month, and you're going to have crisis built into your plan. PRN, as needed, right? And what I think sometimes we have done is we always get the business done, and we say, well, we'll deal with spiritual problems as they come up. Okay? And I don't think that's the biblical model. I think the biblical pattern suggests we should schedule the spiritual and deal with the business PRN. We deal with the business when it comes up and when it's needed to be handled. We delegate good men into serving in good roles, or delegate good, not just men, but people. It doesn't have to be just men. Delegate out responsibility to handle the business of the church, while the men who are called to guide us, and the Bible spends the whole New Testament talking to us about how all the spiritual qualifications. Here's my simple argument, is the Bible doesn't spend all that time talking about the spiritual qualifications for men to get into a room and handle business. And I am not, hear me clearly, I'm not just talking about here, I'm talking about every church I've ever seen. If we're truly going to be non-denominational churches, we've got to say, if the Bible says this has got to be us, whether or not we like it or not, whether or not it's been what we've done before or not. All right, I'm going to get off my hobby horse, okay? It's my hobby horse because I think it's serious. And I think it's needed in our churches that we free up elders to deal with the spiritual things of the church. That's why we pick spiritual men. Okay? We good? Anybody mad? Okay. Maybe. We'll see. All right. Christ in the heart, sheep in the care. I want men leading this church who have Christ down deep in the depths of their heart, who when I look at them, I say, that man, I see Jesus in that man, and who view their primary role as shepherding the sheep of this church. And that means you, that means me, and it means my kids, it means everybody that I see I'm looking at right here. Okay? And that is my desire in this, is for us to communicate, and for me to communicate those concepts of accountability and spirituality that I think our churches desperately need, because sometimes they are the hurdles that we face towards growth. The church is supposed to be known how? Answer me. How's the church supposed to be known? Somebody say it out loud. I can't hear you. By the way we love one another. I want a church known where people on the outside look, I can't wait to be a part of that. I want to be a part of that, because those people, hey, and they'll look at those weird, quirky people, they're weird, but man, they sure love each other. That's what I want people to see in the church. That's what I want people to see in you, is people who love God, follow Jesus, and love one another so deeply that other people can't wait to be a part of it. And that's why it's so important, so very, very important, when we choose leaders going forward, that we're choosing men who will lead us to love one another better than we have in the past, so that we can build towards the future. Amen? Amen. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I went long. There we go. Sorry. But this is important. It's that important. And so I apologize, but I don't. Because I think we need to be serious as we think through these things. So we're going to have a song. It's a time where we get to just be a family each week. And if you've got spiritual needs, if you've got concerns and cares, we give you an opportunity to let it be known. Not just here, but anywhere. We want to be a family to you. If you're struggling with something spiritual, if you want to know more about what it means to be a Christ follower, please just make sure, whether or not during this song or before you leave, let us know. We'd love to talk to you more about King Jesus, because that's who we want to be like. And that's who we're striving to follow. And we're striving to work to be more like each and every day. And so that's what we want to be. And if you want to know more about that, we would love to talk to you about it. But if you have a spiritual need of any kind that you need prayers of the church, you need to let something off your heart, we would love to help you while we'll stand and sing together.
I am resolved.